The UK is cutting ties with the EU, over 3 years after its Brexit referendum. This factory in Northern Ireland is just one of many UK businesses wondering what exactly will come next. But what we do know, in a matter of hours, the UK will no longer be an EU member state. In December's election, Boris Johnson won an overwhelming majority, unblocking the Brexit deadlock with a raft of pro-Brexit MPs returned to Westminster.
They will have an overwhelming mandate from this election to get Brexit done, and we will honour that mandate by January the 31st.
But it's not that simple.
Boris Johnson pinned his election campaign on getting Brexit done. As February 1st arrives, he can say mission accomplished. But in practice, there's a huge amount of work to do.
The UK now heads into a transition period where many arrangements with the EU actually stay the same. And the British government insists it can sign a trade deal with the EU by the end of the year. It's that agreement that will really set future relations with Brussels.
We are ready to design a new partnership with zero tariffs, zero quotas, zero dumping, a partnership that goes well beyond trade, and it is unprecedented in scope. Everything from climate action to data protection, fisheries, energy, transport, space, financial services, and to security.
Boris Johnson's government says Brexit will also allow it to strike trade deals of its own, far beyond Europe. The UK has already arranged a continuity deal with the South African Customs Union, which includes South Africa, with the promise those arrangements can be built on in the post-Brexit future. But Britain's role in global organisations could be uncertain.
The broader problem at the UN for the UK in things like in forums like the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council or climate change negotiations is that groups are very important negotiating kind of partners and mediators. So the EU is a major group within the UN General Assembly, like the African Union is, the Arab group and so on. And so groups tend to kind of monopolize, or not necessarily monopolize, but they tend to dominate discussions, that a lot of diplomatic activity happens through these groups. And countries that are kind of fall between the groups can find it a bit lonely.
Friday for pro-Brexit group Leave Means Leave is a chance to celebrate what they're calling Independence Day. For Remain campaigners, it's a day they hoped would never come. UK businesses know the winds of change are blowing. They just don't know exactly what deal will be secured. Stuart Smith, SABC News, London.
Independent analyst Christopher Gilmour is on Skype for some insights into BREXIT D'Day. Christopher, good evening and thank you for joining us on The Globe this evening.
Pleasure, Lulu. Good to be here.
Now, emotional scenes from the EU scene earlier today. 73 UK MEPs lose their seats, leaving all EU political institutions and agencies. D-Day is finally here.
Yeah, as it said in the preamble, it's taken 3.5 years from the referendum in June of 2016. The Remain bloc, I think their main problem was that they thought that the Leave campaign was entirely dishonest, and which of course it was. Many of the claims they made were thoroughly dishonest. I mean, they were downright lies, talking about how much it was costing to stay in the EU. But it swayed a lot of people. And I think the other factor here is that the Leave campaign also appealed to a lot of xenophobes up in the north of England, especially. The blue-collar workers up in the likes of Manchester and Leeds and places like that. People who wanted to get rid of the Polish and Romanian and Slovak workers who did a lot of relatively low-level jobs, artisan-type jobs, but at a fraction. When I say a fraction, I'm talking a quarter, maybe 20% of what the equivalent British worker would charge. So there's a lot of resentment there amongst these blue-collar types. So that is what I say. The Leave campaign, I think, was based on a lot of xenophobia. It was based on a lot of dishonesty. But, you know, at the end of the day, they got 17.4 million people voting to leave, and they finally got it. But now, you know, they're going to this brave new world that they've got, and I, for one, I think it's a massive mistake. I think Britain will live to regret this one, and I think it will ultimately lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom, both from Ireland and Scotland seceding from the Union. But that'll take a little bit of time. And frankly, I think you're again, the preamble put it very, very well indeed. In this global economy, which is probably going into recession in global terms next year and the year after, you want to be part of a large group like the EU. You don't want to be going out looking to try and cement trade deals at this point in time. It's going to be incredibly difficult.
Now, there's an 11-month transition period, and the UK is expected during this period to continue following the rules of the EU, and the European Court of Justice continuing to have a final say over legal disputes. What happens after the transition period?
Well, that transition period is supposed to end in exactly a year's time. Well, 11 months' time, at the end of December this year. And if they don't get agreement on a variety of things, then Britain may well crash out without a proper deal. In other words, all of the problems that they talked about in the previous Parliament might just come back to haunt them. So they've got an awful lot of negotiation to take place in the next 11 months. And frankly, I don't think it's doable. If you look at historical precedent, when other countries try to do this with the EU, it's typically taken 3 to 5 years. So given the fact that Britain has been a member of the EU, in some ways it makes it easier, but in other ways it makes it difficult, because I think the EU will naturally want to try and make it more difficult for Britain to leave, so that some other countries who are perhaps thinking of doing this in the future might change their minds.
Now, Chris, just speaking of other countries and the possibility of a trade taking place, or trade agreements, and the fact that now the UK can have discussions with other countries, inclusive of the US and Australia. Do you think that it's become a level playing field? As you just mentioned, that it is going to be very difficult. It's not going to be easy. It will take time. But is there a possibility that this might work out in terms of trade deals with other countries, inclusive of the US and Australia?
Yes, and look, take it a bit further than that. I think, strange enough, I think South Africa will actually do quite well out of this. Because South Africa will keep its trade deals with the EU, obviously, but it'll probably get a nice trade deal with Britain, and probably fairly quickly. And South Africa sells a lot of mainly primary products into the UK, and I suspect they'll start selling an awful lot more of them. But talking specifically about the US and Australia, for example, the US. And I think I've said this before on this show, the US over the past 2 or 3 years has used trade as a weapon. There is no country in the world that has a lower ratio of trade to GDP than the US. So if they want to take a very hard line approach with a country, and if they want to, in inverted commas, bring it into line and get them to do what they want to do, the easiest, quickest way is to do it with trade. So Britain, I think, is if they want to do it quickly with the US, they're going to have to accept an awful lot of things that might otherwise be fairly unpalatable. So, for example, when Donald Trump was in the UK recently, there were suggestions that US healthcare companies might well get parts of the national health system in the UK. Now, that is something that is not going to fly with the normal British voter. So that's why I think it's going to be a difficult and protracted set of agreements, and it's not going to be the one-year process that a lot of people, both in America and Britain, try to make out.
Now, Chris, let's speak about, issues or things of significance that are going to change. For instance, the passports. The UK passports are going to change colour. Do they really need to change colour, or is it just to stamp the authority of the fact that now Brexit has finally come, D-Day is here, and now we're moving on and separating from the EU altogether, and we need the colour change? Is there any significance to the passports changing?
Oh, no, I think there is. The colour change is harking back to a previous passport which you had prior to the 1980s, when you had harmonisation of passports throughout the EU. I think it was always a blue one. So yes, it's going to go back to that. And you're right, it's going to try and stamp its authority. In fact, what it's going to do is going to have precisely the opposite effect. You know, I've got dual nationality. I've got South African citizenship and British citizenship. And sometimes I use my UK passport when going into European countries where it's difficult to use as an African. I haven't got a Schengen. So recently I was in Switzerland, and I just took out my EU passport, and they didn't even look at it. They weren't even interested. As soon as they saw it, that was it. That isn't going to happen with a British passport. They're going to look at it, and they're going to scrutinise it. They're going to give it the good once over. And, you know, it's not going to be easy for travellers. Things like, for example, the European Health Insurance Card, EHIC, that comes to an end after tomorrow night, which means that no longer will Brits be able to get free hospital treatment in the rest of Europe, as they currently do. That's all going to stop. They're not going to be able to go and study and in a free way as they've done before. They're not going to be able to claim benefits in the EU. All of this free movement of people is going to come to an absolute grinding halt. And I think a lot of those people to whom I referred earlier, a lot of those xenophobes up in the north of England, when they go on their annual summer vacation to some southern parts of Europe, I think it's going to hit them when they come to the immigration section of the airports there. And for the first time in many, many years, they're going to get the third degree.
Now, Chris, you touch on very key issues with regards to the travelling and, you know, the health insurance. What about things that we generally take for granted, like driver's licenses? What happens there? You know, if you have an EU driver's license and you have an UK driver's license, how's that going to change? And if it is going to change in any way?
That one I'm not so sure about, Lulu. Again, there has been harmonisation of these things. That, I suspect, will change. You know, when you get a UK driver's license, it's got the EU symbol on it, you know, the blue background and the stars and stuff like that. So that may well change. You've mentioned the passport. I suspect they'll change the driver's license thing as well. That won't be problematic. In the same way as foreigners coming into this country, you know, they just drive on their foreign license for the duration of their trip. The same thing happens in Europe, so I don't think that will be a problem. That I think will be one of the less problematic things.
Now, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson now is only going to attend EU summits by invitation. Do you think the adjustment from, you know, always being present, always being needed to be present in terms of decision making, not only just as Boris Johnson, the individual, but just looking back in history for the number of years that, you know, the UK has been part of the EU? This totally changes. If they don't want the British Prime Minister or the UK Prime Minister to be present, they generally won't need to send an invitation. But if, you know, only by invite, what's this going to do for the Prime Minister and the Brits?
Yeah, look, I don't think that's going to faze him too much. I was just talking on social media the other day. Nigel Farage, excuse me, the Brexit party leader, made the point that Britain's always been a reluctant participant of the EU. And that's going back over, 48 years now. 47 years, when it joined what was called the European Economic Community back in 1973. It's been an outlier, and it's not just the geographical position of the country, the fact that it's an island and separated by the North Sea. It's the fact that they regard themselves, or the English, should I say, have regarded themselves as being somewhat different. They're European, and yet they're not. So Johnson getting invitations from the European Parliament, I don't think that'll faze him in the slightest. In fact, I think it'll play to his strengths. He'll see that as something that he'll say, well, they're really not taking us seriously. But at the end of the day, there are going to have to be very serious negotiations if both sides are serious about getting a deal worked out before the end of December this year.
What happens if they don't reach agreement on a lot of issues, or the deal doesn't really take place? Is it just that everybody goes in their own direction and work out their own issues? What happens after the 11-month transition period?
Well, Lulu, that's a fascinating question, because it can go one of two ways. I alluded to it earlier and said, look, maybe what will happen is that Johnson will stick to his guns and they'll crash out without a deal, and they'll just go into World Trade Organization terms. Having said that, he's got such a comfortable majority in Parliament that he can ride roughshod over all sorts of fringe elements within his own party, like the European Research ERG, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, people like that. And he can say, well, you know what? We do need a bit of extra time, a bit of breathing space. Let's go for another 6 months to a year. And as I say, he's got such a comfortable majority. He's got the latitude to be able to do that when we come to the end of December. Whether he will or not, I don't know. You see, you can never tell with Johnson. He's full of bluff and bluster, and that's been one of his characteristics ever since taking office, and even before that. So what he says and what he does are not necessarily the same thing. So I think one of two of those things can materialize in December this year.
Chris, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Only a pleasure.
That's independent analyst Christopher Gilmour joining us via Skype.